Hey guys, welcome to the third video in my Milky Way editing series. This is a series where we take a look at different problems you're going to face when you're doing long exposures at night. The first video we covered amp glow and how to remove that. The second video we talked about hot pixels. And then today we're going to talk about the most common occurrence, and that's just grain or noise caused by low light and high ISOs. Now in this video I really want to clear up ISO because I know there's a lot of misconceptions about what's actually going on, and the more that we understand about ISO, ultimately the better photos we can take and the easier our Milky Way photography is going to become. So that said, let's take a look at some ISO examples first, and then we'll try some Photoshop techniques to remove the grain in our photos. Alright, so let's look at our different ISO images now. This is ISO 100. You'll notice it's just bright enough to capture some of the stars, and you can see some of the faint city lights. Now, before we go on, I want to make sure that everybody understands the only setting changing between each one of these photos is the ISO. My shutter speed was locked to 20 seconds, and my aperture was locked down at f2.8. So the only setting changing was the ISO. And as I increase the ISO, the image appears to get brighter, and now we can actually see the Milky Way. If I keep going all the way to 6400, we can actually see the foreground now. So that's pretty impressive, from a pitch black night sky to actually seeing the ground there. But understand that when we increase the ISO, we're not actually gathering more light. All we're doing is brightening or amplifying whatever light we captured, in this case at the ISO 100 level, since that's my camera's base ISO. Again, at ISO 100, this is all the light the camera captures. This is all it's ever going to capture with my shutter speed and aperture set the way they were. What happens though is that the camera takes this image and then it brightens it by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 stops in camera, and then it gives me this image or this image or this one. So let me show you that in Photoshop to prove my point. And I'll take all my different photos taken at different ISOs, load them up into Camera Raw, and here we have ISO 6400. You'll notice it's very bright. Let me reset these real fast. And all right, so let's take our ISO 200 image. If I increase this by 5 stops, it should look identical to the ISO 6400 image. So I'll put in 5 on my exposure, and this is the ISO 200 image brightened by 5 stops in Camera Raw versus the ISO 6400 image straight out of the camera. You'll notice they're pretty much identical. So that pretty much clearly shows you that you're still always capturing the same amount of light. You're simply brightening the exposure in camera. And let's look at the ISO 100 image now. If I increase this by 3 stops, that would be like going from 200 to 400 to 800. So let me put in 3 plus 3, and I'll compare that against my 2, 4 ISO 800 image. They look identical. Again, if your aperture and your shutter speed are staying the same and all you're increasing is your ISO, the amount of light entering the camera is not changing. It's simply doing this brightening effect in camera and then saving that raw or JPEG file with this brightness baked in. Now the interesting thing is, if you have an ISO invariant sensor, which my Nikon D750 has an ISO invariant sensor, this allows me to shoot all the way down, if I want to, at ISO 200, and then I can brighten the exposure in post-processing by 5 stops, and again that's going to give me an equivalent image to ISO 6400 without any weird graphical artifacts. And that's just Photoshop loading. But that's kind of an interesting little twist to this whole thing, is that with an ISO invariant sensor, you can always do this brightening after the fact without any quality loss. If you have an ISO variant sensor though, if you did this, increase the exposure by 5 stops, this would look really messed up, and it just wouldn't be a good idea to do that. So if you want to learn more about ISO invariance, if you go to my website, peterslinko.com, if you go to my blog, you'll see this post here, and I really break this down into a lot more detail, And there's a bunch of links here as well, so you can really dive into this rabbit hole of ISO invariance, and that'll really help your Milky Way photography out if you at least understand this concept better. Maybe you don't have an ISO invariant sensor, but at least you'll understand the concepts better. So with that being said, we can finally try some Photoshop editing techniques to remove the grain in our photos. Okay, so we're in Adobe Camera Raw now, and before we go on, I want to make sure everybody's clear. The only way to reduce the noise in our images is to simply capture more light. That's the only way, and that's the best way. So what that means is use a longer shutter speed or use a wider aperture. Now, of course, if we're shooting at f2.8, realistically it's pretty hard to get a more wide open aperture than that, especially on a wide angle lens. So we're kind of stuck there. So let's say we're stuck on aperture, we can't get any wider if we're at f2.8 or f1.4. The only way to capture more light then would to be having a longer shutter speed. But if we have a longer shutter speed, our stars are going to start to move, and it's going to ruin the sharp stars in our photos, obviously. You can see this was a 15-second exposure, and I did that to make sure these stars were all very sharp, but because the exposure was so short, there's a lot more noise in the photo if I increase the exposure. The only way to really have a longer shutter speed is to use a star tracker. Now this is something I personally haven't delved into yet. I've seen some really spectacular images though where pretty much you buy the star tracker and it locks onto a star and it moves the camera over the course of a minute or however long you set it. So if you do that method, you can drastically reduce the noise in your photos simply because you're capturing so much more light. So that's a good alternative, but I know for most people it's not in the budget to get a very wide open lens or to buy a star tracker. So that leaves us with trying to fix it in post-processing. And there's a couple ways we can do that. One of my favorite ways is to simply use the Detail tab in Adobe Camera Raw. And let's zoom in here. You'll see there's quite a bit of noise at ISO 6400. Again, the ISO doesn't really matter what our ISO is per se. It's really just about how much light we captured. But if I increase the luminance, I don't like to go above 30. If I go above 30, you'll notice we really start to lose a lot of detail, and if I go all the way, it just becomes a muddy mess. So you can play around with this and see what looks best to you, but in my experience, 30 is kind of my upper limit. But you'll see it really takes the edge off of that noise. And that's usually my first step, is to just increase the luminance to get rid of some of that harsh noise. Now if you watched our other two videos, the amp glow tutorial and the hot pixels, let's do this. You'll see there's quite a bit of amp glow in this photo as well as a few hot pixels. There's one there. So why don't we try a couple different techniques here. But since we are focused on noise today, we'll open this up into Photoshop. Alright, so there's a couple different options we can try to reduce some of the noise in here. The first one I usually try is Nik Collection. This is a free download you can get from Google, and it just plugs right into Photoshop. And we want the Dfine 2 software. And you'll notice in this case it found 3 different areas, and it's going to try and automatically reduce the noise. Actually, 5 different areas. So let's hit OK and we'll see what happens. Normally that's all automatic. You shouldn't have to really mess around with that one too much. So we can see they did a really nice job. If I zoom way in so you guys can see it better on the video, that really took the edge off of the grain there. And if I zoom into the sky, frankly I don't know if it looks as good in the sky. It's kind of creating some artifacts around the stars. So all in all, I think it did a good job. This is one where if I do enable it, I might create a layer mask and then paint out the sky so that way there's no artifacts at all. And then let's just say that's good. I can duplicate the layer and then I'll invert the layer mask, hit Control I. So now I'm only affecting the sky, and I can just lower the opacity so it's not as effective. And so there's the before and the after. So that just helps take a little bit of edge off the grain without creating any artifacts. So that's the first way, is using the Nik Collection Dfine 2 software. Now if you don't have the Google Nik Collection, you can still use Photoshop. This might only be on the CC versions, so if you're on CS6 or one of the older suites, follow along. This might not work for you though. If you go up to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen, oddly enough this is where it's hidden at, and by default this is going to have a sharpening of 200%, which we don't want that, so I'm going to turn that all the way to 0. But you'll notice there's a reduce noise slider here, and I can increase this until it looks good over here, then hit OK. And just like Lumanince and the Nik Collection, this kind of takes the edge off of that noise with a little bit of detail loss, but it does make things look quite a bit better. Now, by far the best method to reducing noise in your photos is to take multiple photos and then do a median stack blend. Now, I've already made a full length tutorial on this on my YouTube page, so you can go and watch that video for all the details. But you need to have taken those photos while you were out there. If you don't have them, then you're stuck doing these noise reduction techniques I showed you today. But the median stack will get you a lot better noise reduction, and it can actually increase the detail in your photos. A couple caveats with that method though: you want to take those photos one after the other so the stars aren't moving between each frame, and you can't use a wide angle lens for the sky because there's some weird distortion that occurs with the wide angle lenses and the way the stars move. So Photoshop will never be able to align all the stars, and the blending will fail and things will get blurry. However, since the foreground is always static, or it should be, you can always use the median stack mode and blend the foreground, so you can always have noise-free foregrounds even if you have some noise in your sky. So if you want to learn more, again, that's a separate YouTube video, and that really is your best way to remove noise. So hopefully this video cleared up all the misconceptions about ISO and what causes grain in your photos. And again, if you want to learn more about Milky Way photography, you can go over to my website or check out the other videos I've posted where we reduce and remove the amp glow and the hot pixels in your photos. Thanks for watching, guys.